It is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Keith Adamson. Keith Adamson, who is currently an assistant professor teaching stream at the Factor and Wintosh Faculty of Social Work, University of Toronto. Prior to that, Keith was the Senior Director, Collaborative Practice at Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital. Keith has more than 20 years of experience in clinical, senior management, and professional practice leadership roles. He is frequently consulted on issues of anti-Black racism and crisis de-escalation. During his keynote address, Keith will take the opportunity to describe what racism is and what racism looks like in Canada. Keith will discuss the impact of racism on people of color and will use this presentation to implore social workers and social service workers to take steps towards starting to remedy and promote healing within their own practice and the communities and clients they serve. He will share his thoughts around advocacy and what social workers and social service workers can do to address racism at all levels. Please join me in welcoming Keith Adamson.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kurgiantakis. I want to thank the college for creating a space to have this conversation today. A conversation about race, and more extensively, a conversation about racism. My hope for the profession and for the regulator of the profession is that this will be one of many conversations that the profession will have on this topic. And these conversations are critical because it's important for social workers and social service workers to take stock of who we are as professionals, how we have contributed to or are contributing to racism. And therefore, it's also important that we reflect on lessons learned from the past and offer our professional expertise towards societal healing. We need to move away from the ravages of the seemingly eternal yet unwanted presence of racism in our society. So I entitled the presentation today, Racism at the Front Lines. So what is racism? Racism is a belief system that centers around the idea that one race is superior to the other. Now, race is socially constructed. It's a socially constructed concept that classifies groups of people based on shared characteristics, physical characteristics. It's important to note that within this belief is the thinking that the higher you are on the race superiority scale, the whiter your skin. Without addressing the historical origins of white supremacy, and without addressing the whole idea of the social construction of race, let's just focus on the fact that white supremacy, over time, has become integrated into society on a social and systematic level, leading to widespread mistreatment of non-white people literally across the world, not just here in Canada. In my presentation today, I will allude primarily to one type of racism. This type of racism focuses specifically on the mistreatment and hatred of Black people. This is called anti-Blackness. I'm not sure if many of you social workers or social service workers know this, but the term anti-Black racism was coined by a professor of social work at Ryerson University here in Canada, Akua Benjamin. The term initially explained the complexity of the racial experiences that Black Canadians encountered and is now being used all over the world. So we are going to try to describe the complexity of the Black experience today. Now, it would also be impossible for me to talk about racism in Canada and not touch upon or provide some kind of commentary and examples about a second type of racism, which is anti-Indigenous racism. And anti-Indigenous racism addresses the complexity of the racial experiences that Indigenous people face in Canada. One last comment about racism. Racism is sometimes used interchangeably with other terms, like bias, prejudice, discrimination. I have to admit that as an academic, I should care about the nuances between these terms. But as a Black academic, I do not care anymore about the nuances between these terms. Because all I know is that individuals who experience any of these phenomena are denied the opportunity to participate fully in their lives, or are denied the opportunity to fully benefit from the potential in their life. These phenomena represent extra hurdles which are grossly unfair. So I've kind of given you my worldview on racism. I think that given the recent racial tensions in the United States and Canada, we're even more aware that racism is not a mundane phenomenon. Racism has life and death consequences and must be dealt with as a public health crisis. It's a social crisis. Racism has pervasive impacts on the economy, social welfare, policing, health, education, and so much more. And you'll notice that I entitled the presentation, Racism at the Front Lines. Now, I kind of, before doing a presentation like this, I go to colleagues, I say, what do you think? And a couple colleagues said, well, racism at the front lines. Are you going to be addressing systematic racism, right? Institutional racism? Because that's what social workers want to hear. They don't want to hear about the front line. They don't want to feel responsible for what's happening at the front line. Let's not blame people. They want to hear about systematic or systemic oppression. Rules, laws, policies, bylaws, all of these things that come from up high in government or organizations are given life through the interaction of the system with people, wherever that system intersects with human life. And in some way, shape, or form, many of these rules get played out at the intersection where they apply to people. So, front line in this context is meant to signify where war and fighting takes place. And in this presentation, I will show you that people of color, especially Black people and Indigenous people in Canada, historically have fought and must fight against and bear the brunt of oppressive and racist policies, laws, and rules. When race has been an organizing principle in society, and structures have been subtly organized against you, and people have been socialized, consciously or unconsciously, to mistreat you, how do you resist the temptation to not framing your life as a war? Or framing your life as a fight? So today we will talk about racism and what it looks like in Canada. and the impact of racism on individuals. I will first introduce you to a sensitivity awareness framework that should assist you in reflecting on your own awareness of and sensitivity to issues of race and racism. I trust that you will experience the presentation as an opportunity to challenge your worldview about the significance of race as an organizing principle in society, as an opportunity to hopefully inform your thinking about racism, as an opportunity to inspire further conversations on the topic of racism, and as an opportunity to retool your practice from an anti-oppressive stance. I attended a wonderful, a really incredible workshop on racial sensitivity by a brilliant Black scholar and family therapist by the name of Dr. Ken Hardy. And Dr. Hardy's whole career has been organized around studying and talking about race and society's relationship to it. He states that we work very hard to avoid seeing race, acknowledging it, or even naming it. When we do talk about it, he says usually it's polarizing, and it breeds explosiveness, followed by trepidation. Sometimes even having a conversation about racism, it's awkward. And he stated that the perpetual denial of race is problematic because it contributes to the ever-widening chasm between the racially privileged and the racially oppressed. And he suggests that the development of awareness and sensitivity to issues of race, equity, inclusion is often enhanced by individuals developing mastery in three interrelated areas. The areas of seeing, being, and doing. The process of seeing refers to developing an eye to seeing when the nuances and intricacies of race and racism are at play in societal norms, actions, beliefs, interactions. The process of being refers to the phase where one forms a heightened sense of their racial being. And it's a time for examination of internalized racial messages and implicit biases that one holds. At this point, you need to reflect on how racism has impacted the racially oppressed and how one tacitly or implicitly contributes to what you may be seeing. And then you have the process of doing. So you've seen, you've been, what do we do? And so the process of doing refers to having the intestinal fortitude as well as the resolve to tackle issues of race and racism and building the skills to have substantive and progressive conversations about race and racism. So this presentation will be built around these three developmental principles. So let's start with the concept of seeing. Throwing out a question. Do Canadians, or do Canadian social workers and social service workers see the whole picture around Black and Indigenous oppression in Canada? Think about that. There are three pervasive assumptions that are floating around. You hear it in conversations with people that need to be debunked with respect to racism in Canada. And we must pull the veil from over our eyes and address these assumptions. The first assumption is that racism in Canada is not as bad as racism in the United States. That makes us feel good as Canadians. Oh, it's so much more horrible over there. It's disgusting. We're better here. The second assumption states that if you do not see color, you're not a racist. I don't see color. I'm neutral. I treat everybody the same. The third assumption is that people are a lot less racist today than 100 years ago. So Black people, Indigenous people, get over it. I've heard all three of these things in conversations that I've had, and I'm sure you've heard some of them too. So I want to show you a video, and this video addresses the first assumption.
Canada has been really good at convincing itself and the world that the terrible things that come out of colonization somehow didn't happen here.
There's no systemic discrimination. There's no system in Quebec.
Thank God that we're different than the United States.
Their denial is part of the system of systemic racism.
It's an inaccurate history.
This country was founded on systemic discrimination.
We don't talk about the origins, where it comes from, how our whole society is based on white male superiority.
Systemic racism is the normalizing of racism.
It's not directly in your face.
Systemic racism is something that touches every corner of our country, every corner of our institutions.
Commissioner Brenda Lucki said she struggled with the term systemic racism. Later, the commissioner said it does exist in the RCMP.
We definitely have that in the RCMP, and we are not immune to it at all.
These are institutions that were built with the intention and the understanding that they were not really to service people who are not white. There are these myths that we are so radically different from the US. Both countries are founded out of stolen and colonized land. Both countries have attempted genocide on indigenous peoples. Both countries have long histories of slavery.
It's easy to point somewhere else, and it's another form of gaslighting.
In Canada, we talk a lot about, the Underground Railroad, Black people escaping slavery and coming to Canada. But we don't also talk about how after the end of the Civil War in the US, that many of those same Black people went back to the US. And why did they go back? Because on the other side of the border, things were just as bad.
The police target and brutalize and kill Black and Indigenous peoples. We're literally paying for police officers to brutalize and kill us at disproportionate rate.
One of the officers shot him dead.
Moore was shot and killed by a police officer.
I don't understand how someone dies during a wellness check.
The family says the 29-year-old was alone in the unit with officers when she plunged to her death.
Inexplicably killed. Rodney Levi, shot by RCMP.
The ones we see in the media now are just the most recent ones. We've had hundreds and hundreds of cases of brutality and violence, sexualized violence, killings that have never been addressed.
Let's look at the ways this structure has historically been used.
People who were enslaved would run away because they were property, not only labor, they were labor and property. Their masters, their owners would want them back, and they would hire people to go catch them. And police forces emerged out of that.
The whole purpose of the RCMP on the prairies specifically, but across Canada generally, was really to suppress Indigenous dissent.
They were also used to take children, put them into residential schools, not follow up on complaints of the sexual abuse that was going on there.
Black and Indigenous people make up nearly 40% of our federal prison population, while comprising less than 10% of the general population.
So much of the interpersonal stuff that happens between people that policing is now involved in can be better handled in communities when communities are given and have the resources to deal with interpersonal conflict.
A CBC News investigation 2 years ago found nearly half of Canadians who died in encounters with police since the year 2000 were mentally distressed.
We are here to ask for the defunding of the police.
Over the past decade, police budgets have ballooned. You see an increasing militarization of the police for a purpose that we don't understand.
So we need to spend money on mental health workers and a healthcare response, not on sending the RCMP to respond to a wellness check.
What defunding is asking us to do is to come back to the table, examine our structures as they are, and ask, is this appropriate for policing? It's about how do we get society to function as a whole better.
When you're looking at the way that cannabis rolled out in Canada, it wasn't Black or Indigenous folks that were benefiting from this system, even though we were disproportionately charged with those kinds of offenses.
This system is created to produce advantage for people who are marked as white.
You see all these long lineups of university students, of all of these people who now can go buy it recreationally, pretty much like they did before. I mean, you're talking about a very low arrest and conviction rate for white people compared to Black and Indigenous.
When it transforms into the realm of the legal, it's okay. The representation of it becomes white and white people.
And then no real substantive justice for all of those with criminal records for weed possession, and some still in prison today with weed charges. And where is the justice in that?
And that is what we mean when we say that institutional racism is a part and parcel of all the institutions, governing and non-governing, of Canadian life. We've come to a moment in our culture where to call someone racist is seen as more offensive than the person's racism.
When we call it out, we get told that it doesn't exist. We get told that we're being radical.
Jagmeet Singh, the first federal party leader of color, called a Bloc Québécois MP a racist, and when he wouldn't apologize, was ordered to leave the chamber.
It started with a motion on systemic racism in the National Police Force.
Je l'appelais un raciste et je le crois.
Singh says it wasn't just a Bloc member's decision to oppose his motion on systemic racism that angered him, but a gesture that accompanied it.
And I looked back and I saw that MP not only say no, but make eye contact with me and just kind of brush his hand, dismiss it. And in that moment, I got angry.
What Jagmeet Singh was saying to this person, you are actively engaging in upholding racist systems. Thereby, by definition, you become racist.
Mr. Singh did the right thing in analyzing the gesture, naming it for what it is, and naming the minister for his behavior.
Then the media focused all attention on Jagmeet, who was kicked out of the house for refusing to apologize. Where is the focus on the person who enacted the violence?
The Bloc's leader today said Singh owes MP Alain Terrien an apology.
Me or our team, our MPs, are anything but racist people.
So Mr. Singh became the problem, not the minister with his dismissive gesture.
If our own leaders can't call it out and name it and hold people to account in Parliament, what does that say for our ability to hold anybody else to account and weed it out?
It has to be individual change. It has to be change in policies, practices. It has to be systems change.
We're being offered lots of symbolism without any substance. When I see the Prime Minister take a knee, I think of it as a distraction. Here is the leader of a middle power in the world who could do much to demonstrate what moving towards anti-Black racism could look like. And that's not what we're being offered. We're being offered a knee.
I've disregarded the knee, and blackface just comes right back to my memory.
It was something that I didn't think was racist at the time, but now I recognize it was something racist to do, and I am deeply sorry.
We need to go beyond performance, which serves who? It doesn't do anything for the victims of racism.
So part of our work is for all of us to become more self-aware about what it is we're asked to do.
You don't have to be a protester. There's 1,000 different ways that people can contribute. But silence is also violence.
It may be writing to your boards of education and asking them to take responsibility for changing curriculum to give a more accurate history.
If something's racist, we need to call it out.
And that's why Idle No More was so powerful, Wet'suwet'en Strong protests were so powerful, and these protests are so powerful because it's Black and Indigenous peoples and Canadians saying, you've got to stop this.
A Canadian identity that would be worthwhile is an identity that begins to undo the myths of Canada.
I hope you enjoyed that video. It really gave you a lovely snapshot of the experiences of racism for Indigenous and Black people in Canada. Now, here's a study that further reveals what racism looks like in Canada. And this study was done by Dr. Arjumand Siddiqui in 2017. And Dr. Siddiqui led a Canadian study that looked at racial differences and experiences of discrimination. As you can see, the chart reports on 4 items that addressed experiences of discrimination. The chart suggests that Black and Indigenous participants both experienced nearly twice the odds of whites of being treated with less courtesy or respect. A similar pattern across racial groups also emerged for experiences of being treated as smart. Blacks were nearly 3 times at greater odds than whites to receive poorer service. And look at the odds of experiencing being feared by others, which was more than 4 times higher for Blacks when compared to whites, and Indigenous individuals over twice as high when compared to whites. And so there are many, many studies like this that are emerging, that are coming out, that point out the deleterious experiences of racism, in particular, racism towards Black and Indigenous members of Canadian society. So this is the end of the first assumption. The next assumption is that people who do not see color are somewhat neutral, not racist. Again, I ask you, is this stance helpful or harmful? Now, as noble as it sounds, and though it may come from a good place, there are some people who say this is not a good stance to adopt. The workshop that I spoke to you about previously with Dr. Hardy, he says that even more than gender, race is likely the first observable physical characteristic of a person. Race tells its own constructed story about a person before we ever get to know that person. And it's not just ignorant people who have encoded in their psyches that white is good and black is bad. We all do to varying degrees. We've been sauced in it. This is the society. And sadly, I think most of us avoid facing up to it. Not seeing color denies racism. And though it may be meant to mean that you look at someone's character and not the color of their skin, not seeing color means you do not see me as a black person. Somehow, when you think of it, that means that seeing color is bad somehow. But seeing color is not bad. Seeing color should not be associated as something that is bad. That color, this color, comes with a history. By not seeing color, you implicitly imply that color is bad. So, when some white people ignore or misunderstand the political and historical nuances around color, it leads to abuses of white privilege. Here's an example. So a group of black students at a school in Calgary were talking amongst themselves, and they used the N-word. The principal was walking by and challenged the use of the word by the black students. During this interaction, one of the black students taped her principal uttering, "If you can say the N-word, why can't I say the N-word?" Saying the N-word. Questioning the student's use of the N-word. The student who recorded it posted it online, calling the principal's choice of words unacceptable. Well, what do you think happened to those students? You can see in the headline what happened. They were all suspended. The whole group of black students, they were all suspended. And the school board said that the principal was using the N-word strictly for educational purposes. Not just that. The girls were also suspended because they broke the rules or the policy around recording in public spaces. Of course, the Catholic school board vigorously defended the principal and talked about the Catholic community of caring, where they teach values based on faith, care, and respect. Color had nothing to do with this. Absolutely nothing happened to the principal, and the school board cited that nothing happened to the principal because it would be unfair. I want you to think about that a little bit. After reducing everything to the most common denominator, I want you to really sit down and ask yourself honestly, what was the primary lesson for everyone who witnessed this event, this incident? What did the principal learn? What did the other white students learn? What did the black children learn? I'll put it out there. You may choose to disagree. I'll hypothesize that the white children who are privileged saw that it was okay to say the N-word and have no consequence. And that when the black kids speak up, they get in trouble. Here's another situation. Similar situation at the University of Ottawa, where a part-time professor used the N-word while teaching a class. Now, the professor faced backlash from the students, and to the professor's credit, she wrote a letter apologizing for the racist comment. However, as word spread across the country about the incident, 34 current and retired professors wrote a letter of support to the professor, meaning they supported use of the N-word. And that was published in the French paper La Presse, saying that academic freedom was at play. This wasn't about color. General alert. You should hear the sirens now. Woo, woo, woo. General alert. There is no reason for any person who identifies as white to use the N-word. Now, Black people may use the word as a way of reclaiming power over a word that was used to oppress them. If you are part of the privileged group and you are using the word, you are being racist. Also, please note, the context and the intention do not matter once you have used the N-word. It is the impact of the word on the Black people around you that you should be concerned about. This is the end of the second assumption. The third assumption is that some people believe that it's 2020, racism is not as bad as it used to be, and so Black and Indigenous people, you need to just move on and get on with it. And so, as if history has no impact on the present, let me give you a few examples of how powerful history is on shaping the present. So, many immigrants and people of color in Canada see professional education as a way to improve their social mobility. And so professional education in communities of color may be an aspiration. Medicine is historically one of those professions that, if you get access to, raises your social mobility. Did you know that Queen's University Senate voted to ban Black students from enrolling in its medical school in 1918? The ban on Black students studying medicine was in effect for decades, then forgotten, and wasn't officially repealed until just 2 years ago in 2018. Let me also add that McGill, Dalhousie, and the University of Toronto also excluded Black students or placed restrictions on their admission for varying periods of time. Let me ask you another question. I know I'm asking a lot of questions, but just think this out with me here. Do you think, given what I've just said, do you think there is a representative cohort of Black students graduating from medical schools today in this country? What you see on this slide is a picture of the only Black medical student graduating in 2020 from a class of 259 at the University of Toronto. And there are stories like this one all across the country where you have 1 or 2 Black students among a class of nearly 300. We need to understand that these numbers are not by accident. What we see today is happening through historical design. That's why I put these two pictures beside each other so that you see there is a connection. This isn't happenstance. It's not by luck. Today, Black students are still massively underrepresented in medical schools. Now, to the University of Toronto's credit, they've initiated special programs to redress these historical wrongs, if you want. I'm proud to say that this year, I think they admitted 24 students. Now, yes, I'm excited that they admitted 24 students. Should it have been national news? I don't know. The policies of the past will continue to reverberate far into the future. So I'll say, yeah, it was good that it was 24 is a start. But the social disadvantage that has been engendered historically, we will still have to live with that in the near future. Another example of where history continues to perpetuate racism in the Canadian context is child welfare. This example is closer to home given the historical role of social work in taking Indigenous children away from their families and sending them to residential schools. The picture you see on this slide depicts a First Nations residential school juxtaposed against a picture of Dr. Cindy Blackstock. And Dr. Blackstock is a fierce advocate for childcare services everywhere. The reason why these are two interesting pictures to put beside each other is because Dr. Blackstock fought the federal government for discriminating against First Nation children on reserves. She successfully argued that the funding that the federal government provided for child welfare on reserves was much lower than the support provincial governments gave to children off reserve, even though on reserve needs were greater. Less funding for family support meant more children would end up in the child welfare system. Dr. Blackstock figured that out. Dr. Blackstock won her argument in the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. And in the tribunal's decision, the judges compared on-reserve child welfare to the residential school system, where the fate and future of many First Nation children was still determined and being determined by the government. That's why I put those two pictures beside each other. The last slide, this slide shows a picture of Ota Benga, who was captured at the age of 21. He stood just 4 feet tall and weighed 103 pounds. And he was brought to the US and put in a cage at the Brooklyn Zoo with monkeys in 1906. He was advertised as the missing link for an exhibit. They described him as the only genuine cannibal in America. They even took the liberty of sharpening and shaving his teeth so he would look more like a monkey. And that is juxtaposed against a picture of a story of a 6-year-old Black girl who the police handcuffed for her own protection and the protection of others in Mississauga. The theme here is that before you mistreat someone, you really have to see them as less than human, merely an object. The one question I usually ask myself when I hear stories like the one in Mississauga is, if that was a 6-year-old white girl, would they have handcuffed her? And I usually have an instant answer in my head. It's just instantaneous. The probability is usually on the no side. And so I've created a term that kind of thinking, a term that kind of describes that kind of thinking, and it's called the counterfactual. And I say to myself, if the person was X, would X have happened? And we do that all the time. In other words, if the person was white, would this have happened? So I trust that we are seeing how the ability to see racism in all its intricacies and nuances is a first step. At this point, I want to address the second concept in the sensitivity framework, the idea of being. The second step is to reflect on who you are as a person, your being, and ask yourself, how have I been racially socialized? And what are my biases? What are your biases? And to a further extent, it invites reflection on how those biases potentially are impacting people of color or people of a subjugated group. Racism has a social cost. The totality of ways in which society fosters racial discrimination through reinforcing inequitable systems is apparent in housing, education, credit, healthcare, criminal justice, that in turn reinforce beliefs, values, and distribution of resources. Some authors, such as Thomas Shapiro, who wrote a book called Toxic Inequality, put forward the idea that inequalities are driven by structural racism that was designed to advantage one group over another. Another example closer to home, in 2018, the Neighborhood Exchange Research Partnership showed that there was, in fact, racial segregation in the Toronto housing market, wherein in high-income neighborhoods, so that was about 102,000 and up, whites made up 73% of inhabitants. In the middle-income neighborhoods, about 49 and up, whites made up 61% of inhabitants. And in low-income neighborhoods, whites made up 31% of inhabitants. Whereas people of color made up the majority of inhabitants in low-income neighborhoods. There's also a psychological impact to racism. One of the articles that you see here explains the hidden wounds that emerge from what advocates are calling racial trauma. The articles tell us that mental health professionals, we need to look out for certain things. So, for example, young Black children and adolescents who exhibit different forms of what they may call bad behavior. But what we may fail to recognize is the racial oppression that may be contributing to that bad behavior. And what we should be asking is not what's wrong with them. We should be asking what happened to them? What happened? There's one of the articles there, the Healing the Hidden Wounds of Racial Trauma. It talks about 4 hidden wounds. The first wound is internalized devaluation, where the youth internalizes that non-whiteness is not a good thing. And so because they feel profoundly devalued, they become hypervigilant about gaining respect. The second wound is an assaulted sense of self, where the emotional, psychological milieu is inundated with race-related messages like, you're not as attractive as, not as smart as, not as intelligent as, not intelligent enough, you're not college material, not welcome to. And these are all messages that you get through experiences with people. The third wound is internalized voicelessness, where situations may silence the individual, which ultimately impairs the ability to advocate for oneself. We only have to go back to those examples of the Catholic school, and you see how silencing becomes easy. The fourth wound is rage. Rage. Rage builds over time as a result of suppressed emotions precipitated by voicelessness. And the article goes on to say that youth may be prescribed anger management, while the hidden wound of racial oppression remains unaddressed. There are studies that basically show that racism affects people at the cellular level of their biology. It's possible that experiencing racism can potentially make people sick. An interesting study proposed what is known as the weathering hypothesis, which posits that Black individuals experience early health deterioration as a consequence of the cumulative impact of repeated social, economic, and political marginalization. The stress inherent in living in a race-conscious society that stigmatizes Black people may cause disproportionate physiological deterioration. So, researchers decided to measure the allostatic load, which is a biomarker for stress hormones in the body between different races. What they found was that Black men and women had higher mean allostatic load scores than white people of all ages. They also found that non-poor Black, so Black individuals who had money, financially secure, had greater probability of higher allostatic load scores than did poor whites. That speaks to the power of racism. Even when you're rich, doesn't matter. So, I want to show you another video. This video might hit closer to home. This happened in Ontario. And this is a video that shows us the impact of racism in healthcare.
There's a much higher chance, in my opinion, that I would have gotten that same procedure quicker if I wasn't Black.
John Rivers' terrifying experiences with Canada's healthcare system started in 2017 following a spinal tap test that left him with side effects. But instead of getting the emergency epidural blood patch he says he needed to recover, the award-nominated Canadian musician waited 60 days as his health continued to deteriorate. Now he's launching a lawsuit against the hospital and urging governments to tackle racism in healthcare.
You know, the triage nurse said to me, she said, "You were here 3 days ago. I assume you are just here for drugs."
River, whose real name is Matthew John Derek Huey, was experiencing excruciating pain at the back of his head, vision loss, and lost sensation in his hands and feet. But on numerous occasions, he says he was accused of faking his pain in order to get narcotics. With his original doctor on vacation, the now 25-year-old says he visited over 5 hospitals in the GTA with no luck finding a doctor who would perform the procedure.
Where you had, some physicians saying, did you just have a spinal tap? We think you need to have this blood patch, the follow-up procedure. And others saying, we refuse to do any testing, give you an MRI, give you any objective testing, because what you need to understand is this is a mental issue.
According to the Mississauga native, he was also told he was just imagining his pain and was admitted to the psych ward for 2 days. He was advised by friends and members of his community that race and stereotypes played a role in the level of care he received, and that he should avoid dressing a certain way, for instance, not wearing baggy clothing. On one terrifying day, his mom would go to extreme lengths to ensure what he was wearing wouldn't negatively impact him.
My mother was trying to fasten on a button-up shirt to my unconscious body on a stretcher.
Racism in healthcare has been acknowledged by medical professionals, governments, and advocates. And one expert says River is no exception to a system that is fraught with racial bias.
On the surface, what it looks like is that wasn't a life that was valued. That was a life that was dismissed. And that's the experience that many racialized people are having.
John's family shared his story on social media, and fellow Canadian artists threw their support behind him. He credits their support for helping him get treatment in February 2018.
What scares me the most is that I know that there's a million other kids who are not rappers, a million other rappers who do not have the following that I did.
Later on City News, the initiative some medical experts want hospitals to implement that Toronto police are already getting ahead on.
Had I not been black, there was a much higher chance I would have gotten better treatment way earlier.
Every year, millions of Canadians walk into a hospital or clinic to get treated, but as healthcare professionals themselves will tell you, not everyone gets treated equally. Studies and anecdotal reports have demonstrated how racism has impacted the level of care racialized communities receive. And John River, who you heard from earlier in the show, is just one example, and his story isn't unique.
Following complications of a spinal tap test, John River visited over 5 hospitals in the GTA, looking for a doctor who would perform the emergency epidural blood path he needed.
Well, on day 30, can I get some help? It's not that bad. You're imagining it. Prove it to me.
He was experiencing extreme pain, vision loss, and lost sensation. But instead of getting help, the 25-year-old says he was oftentimes accused of faking his pain to get drugs or imagining it. It took 60 days to get that emergency procedure, and now that he's recovering, the Mississauga native is telling governments to tackle racism in healthcare.
I know, and you know, that in 3 months, there's going to be another young black man who walks in the hospital, and the exact same thing is going to happen to him that happened to me.
Notisha Massakoy, a health equity consultant, says Canadian healthcare isn't responsive to black communities' needs, adding inequalities have long been documented.
Racialized populations, in particular black populations, are having the worst experiences in the healthcare system, meaning their issues aren't being addressed fast enough, timely enough, appropriately enough, and therefore we're having more premature deaths. We're having higher rates of illnesses that should be preventable.
A few years ago, some local healthcare professionals started collecting race-based data that could help to determine patients' needs. But Massakoy says this is voluntary.
If we don't understand specifically what health experiences black communities and racialized communities are having, we're not going to be able to treat people effectively. We're not going to know what are the major issues, what are the health disparities.
The Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care notes though Ontario mandates the collection of race-based data in other fields, healthcare isn't included. Quote, health information custodians, including hospitals, are not included in the Act due to patient privacy considerations. That said, race-based data is collected at some hospitals in the province at point of care through the We Ask Because We Care survey.
What I would say needs to happen is now the political will to maintain that process, as well as the ongoing training and the mandating of it.
Now, there is more to the story. For a more in-depth look at John's health journey and to learn more about other initiatives underway to tackle racism in healthcare, you can head to our website, citynews.ca.
So this slide basically shows a research study that partially confirms some of the experiences that that young black man spoke about in the video. Now, the reason why I put this slide up with the study by Dr. Williams is because this study was done in 2002, nearly 18 years ago. 18 years ago. And we continue to witness the devastating impact of racism within health and mental health services. We have to do better than this. So, the system, I was talking to one of my friends, black friends in Montreal, who every time there's something that happens in Montreal with respect to racism, he sends me the link. And we were having a conversation and he goes, you know, the system does not need fixing. The system needs to be changed. The racial atrocities we have witnessed over time are the result of a system designed to produce disadvantage for Black and Indigenous people. And the vestiges of history are still at play. I hope that I've provided evidence of that today, though it was probably only a snapshot What can we do as social workers and as social service workers? I think in general, as a profession, we have to look at ourselves first. As social workers and social service workers, who are we as a professional group? I think we need to answer some fundamental questions. Are we a diverse profession in the province of Ontario? Do we recruit individuals into the profession who come from different races, who are Black and Indigenous, and who espouse social work values, principles, who can enrich in social work theory? Do we represent, as a profession, the diversity of the clients we serve? We need to take diversity on as a strategic pillar towards the success of the profession as we move forward. Concurrently, as we prepare to make change, social workers and social service workers need to take up professional development opportunities that will permit them to be culturally sensitive and attuned to the needs of Black and Indigenous clients. Also, social workers can perhaps start to retool their practice or their practices immediately to encompass or by including dimensions of race. So, failure to consider the ways in which racism and various other traumas affect aspects of clients' experiences and presenting problems may lead social workers and social service workers to conceptualize a case maybe not as well as they could had they included race, or may lead to ineffective treatments. Think it through with me. Perhaps social workers and social service workers should integrate questions about race in their social work and social service work assessments. So for example, in the same vein that we would ask questions about sexual orientation or marital status, why not ask questions about race? Questions like, how do you identify racially? How does that identity connect with what you may be experiencing right now? Just those simple questions. And simple questions like this may further signify to Black and Indigenous clients, other people of color, that social workers and social service workers are committed to being collaborators in their healing from oppression on a micro level. So, generally, there has been a model proposed, and there's a model that actually has 5 levels of advocacy that I want to talk to you about. This model was proposed by Schneider and Lester in 2002. And it has 5 levels of advocacy. And it kind of breaks it down. At the client advocacy level, it's expected that members will collaborate with Black and Indigenous clients to protect, enforce, ensure the client's right to entitlements, resources, services, and benefits. I would hope that members are doing that either way. When a social worker performs cause advocacy, they address problems affecting several of their clients who may belong to a particular group or have similar concerns. So here's a simple example. You're a social worker at the school board or a social service worker at the school board, and several Black students are referred to you for behavioral problems. And they all talk to you about similar negative interactions with the same teacher. I would expect that the member would investigate further. Legislative advocacy consists of social workers influencing social policy and legislation at the municipal, the provincial, and federal levels. And social workers and social service workers who know how to address social problems, seek support, and resources for disadvantaged groups, and raise public awareness about the rights and needs of all citizens. All these things kind of go into legislative advocacy. So for example, if there were social workers and social service workers who worked in coalition with other groups to bring an end to the discriminatory practice of academic streaming, which Ontario did this year, where mostly Black children were overrepresented, or if there are members that bring an end and collaborate with certain coalitions for bringing an end to the practice of birth alerts, which disproportionately impacted Indigenous and other racialized mothers, then these are the kind of engagements on the front line we would prefer the members to be undertaking, or we'd like the members to undertake, or we'd like the members to be curious about. Administrative advocacy is built on the notion that social workers and social service workers will promote change from within their agencies. So social workers and social service workers perform administrative advocacy when they address agency policies or procedures that may be harmful to certain groups or clients in general. Okay, so for example, let's think of a social service agency where the social service workers and the social workers decide to ask their administration to address institutional racism through a review of their programming, their hiring, their training, their supervision, and other organizational processes. And just an important thought before leaving administrative advocacy model. I think social workers and social service workers need to encourage their organizations to collect race-based data. Remember, if you do not measure it, it does not exist. As such, social workers and social service workers need to start to keep track and monitor race-based outcomes so that you are able to sound the alarm and address the harms caused by racist policies, rules, laws when needed. I'm going to end here. Racism is bad for everyone. It's not just bad for Black people or Indigenous people. Racism is bad for everyone because it creates inequality, and increasingly, there are studies that cite that inequality is bad for everyone. And there is pervasive evidence that reducing inequalities will diminish spillover effects on the health of society at large. So these could include the spread of infectious diseases, the consequences of alcohol and drug use, or the occurrence of violence and crime. So, if you are willing, as a social worker or social service worker, to be an ally to racially subjugated populations in their fight to participate equally in life, you are also indirectly fighting for the life of all in the human race.
Thank you very much, Keith, for providing such a relevant and necessary presentation. Like me, I'm sure you all found this valuable. I hold myself responsible, and I hope we can all hold ourselves responsible to see, be, and do as social workers, and as social service workers, and as citizens. As I mentioned previously, the educational forum is being live streamed to members across the province. Members are able to participate in this keynote address question period by entering their questions into the call for questions field at the bottom of the webpage. In order to accommodate questions from as many members as possible, we would ask that you limit yourself to one question only. I would now like to ask Sarah Chowdhury, the college's communications manager, to read some of your questions.
Tula. We received quite a number of questions, so we'll go through a few as time permits. So Keith, the first question from David Lavoie. At what point does academia have to take responsibility for educating and supporting racism and systemic oppression? What will it take for academia to change the ways they educate future professionals in a more culturally accepted manner?
Well, first of all, I trust that these are really good questions, and I'm going to try to answer them to the best of my ability. Academia is responsible for the training of professionals. And we have an ethical responsibility to not just train people, but train people for the needs of society. We are training the social workers and social service workers of the future. And so we understand today what some of those societal problems are. We know that racism is a social, there's a problem with racism in society. And as such, we should be training and putting into our curriculum different elements that help our students develop what? Help our students develop cultural sensitivity and attunement. Help our students develop an awareness or a curiosity even around difference. Embedding anti-oppressive practice within our curriculum. These are important things that we should be doing as academics. Again, considering that there are societal issues. As educators, we are responsible for training the future people who will go back into the community to provide healing for those issues.
Thank you, Keith. We received a question from Helena Jakowski. Who are people of color? Who are not people of color? Do you want professionals in our field to treat some differently from others? If so, who, why, and how? If we treat some people differently, then is that not a form of discrimination against some people?
Powerful question. Listen, I am not going to tell somebody if they're a person of color or not. You will identify that for yourself, given your history, given your affiliation, your family history. I can't define that. That's something that you have to define based on your own cultural history. And I'll tell you once, I assumed that somebody was white when they were not. And I'll never forget that. I was in a meeting, and it was a social work student. And she had blue eyes, brunette hair. And in the meeting, most of the people in my staff were white, and I made a cultural reference, and I said, most of you will not understand this cultural reference, but I'm going to say it anyway. And we laughed about it. And the student came up to me after and said, I was really offended by that. And I said, why? She said, because I'm half black. And she took out a picture of her father and showed me. So I'm going to let people identify that for themselves. But here's to the second part of your question around, do we treat people differently? It nearly sounds exhausting when, the question is posed that way because it's as if, well, everybody has to have a different approach. Everybody has to have a different, I have to think about all these different things when I'm interacting with all these different people. Here's what I would say. Treat people fairly. Give people an equal chance. Give people equal opportunities. Give people equal justice. That's my answer to that question.
Thank you, Keith. We'll ask, I think, perhaps maybe one final question from member Sybil Allen. As a Black social worker in the field for 4 decades, I have seen minimal progress in the profession around practitioners understanding and being able to adequately work with and understand the needs of BIPOC clients. This must change. What is the college and the schools of social work across Canada planning to do to address this issue in a meaningful way?
I can't necessarily speak for the college on this one. Maybe, Lise or Tula might want to speak to that at some point. I would say that schools of social work, so it's kind of connected to the first answer that I gave. Schools of social work have a responsibility to look at curriculum that supports anti-oppressive practice, look at curriculum that supports cultural attunement and sensitivity, and look at curriculum that starts to respond to how do we teach people to actually respond to those wounds that we see in the Black population. I'm going to tell you that this summer, since all the racial unrest, I've had a lot of referrals for young Black boys in my practice. And many of them come with school experiences that I would say not just have undertones of racism, but they experienced racist incidences at school, but were, of course, punished when they responded to it. And so in my own practice, as a Black person, I had to think about what this meant. And I recognized that some of the things that I had to do within my practice to change how I approached young Black boys in particular who were referred to me, especially when they talk about instances where, for example, this young man, he was in the cafeteria sitting with his white friends, and one of his white friends threw a sandwich across the room. The monitor came over and said, "You threw that?" And he goes, "No, I didn't throw it." And he goes, the monitor again said, "You threw that?" He goes, "No, I didn't do it." And he asked him a third time. And then the third time, imagine you're 11 years old and you have to give up the person who threw it because now you've been put in the corner. So he said, he did it, which was a white boy. The monitor turned around and left. Given what had happened, the young Black boy says, "Whoa, that was racist." The monitor then turned around, came back, and sent him to the principal's office. The monitor then joined the principal about 30 minutes later, and together they were speaking to the little boy, and they wanted him to take back the comment that he made. He said he would not take it back, upon which he was suspended. And then he had to go through a whole thing with his family as well. So then they call me because now he has behavioral problems. And the more I spoke to him, the more I realized that a lot of his interactions, he started to tell me stories about his experiences at school. How someone told him his hair looked like a mop. So here's my answer to you. Yes, we have to ensure that, schools of social work do bring in anti-oppressive frameworks, and that we train, people to be more culturally sensitive and attuned. But there's also something really specific about racism and racial trauma that we should be also addressing until we eradicate racism from the face of this earth. But until then, I would suggest that we teach social workers how to affirm and acknowledge the pain of young Black men, how to create space for having conversations about race within the therapeutic relationship, how to get Black men to tell their story around race. Something as simple as saying, can you tell me about a time you were treated differently because of your race? And I think we start to get to some of the underlying causes of some of the behaviors that we may be seeing, the bad behaviors that they're usually referred to us for. So I would say that we would want to add very specific culturally focused interventions to clinically address some of these issues. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
So to all the attendees, thank you for participating today. I hope this year's educational forum met and perhaps exceeded your expectations in spite of the extenuating circumstances, and that we were able to support and educate our members. As a reminder, there is a link to a post-event survey available on the college website for you to complete. Following today's event, we encourage you to complete this survey, at which point you will have access to a link to the Certificate of Participation, which you can fill out and print for your records. Thank you all for your participation.